Hi, everybody, and welcome to Chapter 9. We're going to be looking at arranging consequences that decrease behavior. As you can see by the cartoon, we've got a teacher who's saying, "Help, help! This wasn't covered in any of my education courses." And some of the behaviors that we see where we want to decrease the behavior are definitely things where we feel like, good Lord, that wasn't part of my training. But now hopefully it will be part of your training. So when we are looking at principles that guide the selection for behavior reduction, we want to think about a few things. The first of which is we want an intervention that's the least intrusive, and that's true for all interventions that we want to put in place. We also have to make sure that the intervention we're looking at is based on the identified function of the challenging behavior. We know that the best practice based on chapters 1 through 7 is going to be collect data on that behavior, complete a functional behavioral assessment and a behavior intervention plan, and we're going to closely note the function of the behavior. So if the student's function of biting is that they're looking for sensory input, then giving them a sticker chart is not going to be an appropriate or least intrusive intervention plan. What would be an appropriate intervention plan would be giving them that sensory input in a different way. So giving them jewelry or giving them a Twizzler or something else that they can bite on. Maybe they are chewing on a piece of rubber that goes around a pencil. But that would be a more appropriate intervention based on the function of that challenging behavior. We want to make sure that we're moving appropriately along the hierarchy that we're going to look at here in a second, that we're not putting into place this giant plan or an inappropriate intervention, but that we're really baby stepping. And of course, a reminder that we always want to have permission and that we want to consult through that IEP meeting with the team to make sure that that intervention that's being put in place is appropriate and approved by everyone. Looking at this hierarchy of procedural alternatives to reduce inappropriate behavior, we want to start at level 1 with these different kinds of reinforcement we can do that will replace or provide an alternative for a behavior. And we want to move towards that extinction or terminating reinforcement. So a student is naturally doing a behavior or reinforcing themselves. And we want to avoid having to move to levels 3 and 4 unless it's just absolutely deemed necessary. When you think about level 1, and we're thinking about behaviors like kids who are defiant, kids who are fighting, we want to make sure that we're decreasing behavior by either giving very specific contingent reinforcement for a different, more appropriate behavior, or we're using that reinforcement in a non-contingent manner. So ideally, we can think about differential reinforcement of lower rates of behavior. And this is used to decrease a behavior that, while it's tolerable at low rates, it's inappropriate if it happens too much. So an example that I've seen a lot in classrooms is a student that just raises their hand too much. Every 5 seconds their hand is in the air. They're not attending to work. They're constantly wanting to tell you stories, answer every question whether they know the answer or not, ask for special permissions. They're not getting work done. So two different ways that you can look at differential reinforcement of lower rates of behavior is you can look at what's called full session DRL or interval DRL. So in full session DRL, you're looking at the number of total responses that a student might give. So I'm looking at my data and saying, well, in all of my baseline data, Johnny raised his hand an average of 50 times in 15 minutes. So I'm going to look at a lower rate, maybe 30 times per minute, and I'm going to reinforce the student for having that lower rate. If they can get less than 30 times hand raising, then they're going to be reinforced. This works, the full session DRL works when a student can wait. Other students can't wait through a whole session. They couldn't wait for that whole 15 minutes. Or for some students, we can reinforce at the end of the day or the end of the week or the end of a grading period. But there are other students that need much more frequent reinforcing. For students with most extreme behavior, sometimes they need reinforcement every minute. Other students need reinforcement every 5 minutes. So again, my data is going to tell me how often a student would need to be reinforced. And if I need to use interval DRL, then I'm going to break a longer session into smaller parts and reinforce for that behavior that I'm looking for, that target behavior. We can do DRO, or differential rates of other behaviors. And I love the example here. If a student is supposed to work on a book report quietly, so the target behavior was don't talk to your neighbors. If they're working quietly for 30 minutes, they'll get to go to an ice cream social at the end of the day. You can use DRO with permanent product data. So like a book report would be a permanent product data. And note that in this DRO, that one of the variations is that reinforcement is contingent upon the non-occurrence of a behavior. So the behavior that in the example was we did not want them to talk to their neighbors. So as long as they did not talk to their neighbors by working on their book report quietly, then they would get to have that reinforcer. There is also DRA and DRI. These are two of my favorites. I've used these examples in class quite a good bit. So if we're looking at DRA, we're looking at replacing an inappropriate behavior with a behavior that we consider to be more appropriate. So DRA is a more appropriate behavior, and usually that alternative behavior is physically incompatible with the other behavior. So the example is fantastic. I'm going to reinforce Sarah every time she's in her seat because that is incompatible with her typical behavior of just wandering around the classroom, touching things, looking at things. So I want her to be in her seat. I'm going to reinforce her for being in her seat. I can also look at differential reinforcement of an incompatible behavior. And so this is a behavior that's topographically incompatible with the target behavior. So the example here is a student with autism who likes to flap his fingers in front of him or markers in front of him over and over and over again. The incompatible behavior would be use those markers for drawing, and that would be a more appropriate social item, a more appropriate school behavior. So we can look at DRAs and DRIs, those incompatible and alternative behaviors, to get students to do more appropriate school behaviors. Non-contingent reinforcement is used quite often in school, and this is when we deliver reinforcers at predetermined intervals, regardless of what the student is doing. So every 15 minutes, I'm going to be reinforcing a student. So let's look at this example of calling out behaviors. The student is just calling out, calling out, calling out. And in the past, the teacher was giving continual redirection and attention for that calling out behavior. So non-contingent reinforcement would call for the teacher to ignore those calling outs. And the student receives a teacher attention every 5 minutes. So the teacher is saying, Johnny's calling out, blah, Mrs. Clark, Dr. Clark, blah, 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 blah. I'm ignoring that. And every 5 minutes I'm saying, hey, Johnny, tell me what you've got for answer number 3. Hey, Johnny, what's your thought on that? Johnny, how you doing today? Every 5 minutes I'm giving attention, I'm ignoring the calling out. That's non-contingent reinforcement. Level 2, extinction, is reducing a behavior by withholding or terminating a positive reinforcer that maintains an inappropriate target behavior. So sometimes as a teacher, in that example we just saw before, I'm reinforcing a child's behavior, whether I know it or not. His calling out, he's seeking my attention, and every time he calls out, I give him my attention. So in extinction, I'm just going to completely ignore and stop paying any attention to calling out. The important thing about that non-contingent reinforcement is if a student really needs it, and that it might be attention, they're going to find another way to get it. So if I use extinction and quit acknowledging their calling out, they might ramp up their behavior and start hitting or throwing things, because what they're ultimately looking for, the function of the behavior, is my attention. So I need to pair any extinction plan with an appropriate intervention to give them what they need. So whether they need attention, whether they need sensory input, you have to give them what they need and pair that with an extinction plan for extinction to work. So this is a quick summary of, before you consider extinction, you have to know if the behavior is dangerous, I can't use extinction. If Sarah is running across the room and bashing Johnny in the head, I can't just use extinction and ignore that behavior. That has to be handled. Can a reinforcer be withheld? If the main reinforcer is water, I can't withhold water. That's torture and not appropriate. So can't do it. Um, can an increase in the behavior be tolerated? The student is going to ramp up usually if I haven't used some appropriate intervention. And sometimes even with an appropriate intervention, the student has something that's worked in the past, they're going to keep trying it. A great example of this is my TV died the other day, and what has always worked in the past is hitting the on button. So what did I do? Did I get up? Did I try and replug my TV in? Did I reset my cable box? No. I sat on my couch and hit the start button 50 times in a row until my husband came in and said, Laura, did you check the batteries? No. The behavior that's always worked for me in the past, pushing the start button, I expect to work again. It's not working right now, so I'm just going to do it more and hope that that helps. Same way with kids. A lot of times when we're looking at extinction, like for calling out, kids are just going to call out more thinking, well, she didn't hear me. Clearly she wasn't paying attention to me. So can you tolerate that behavior being ramped up while you're putting those other interventions into place? When we think about punishment, we want to think about that as the bottom barrel of our toolbox. And this is not something that we want to think of because a lot of times when we're looking at punishment, we're thinking about things that if we don't have the appropriate intervention in place can lead to some increases in behavior, just like with extinction. So punishment is an undesirable thing that we would put in place, an undesirable intervention that we would put in place right after a student has an inappropriate or undesirable behavior. So an example of punishment might be Sarah is working on her math worksheet and she says to me, I hate this effing worksheet. I'm not doing it anymore. And she rips it up. So my punishment might be to give her 5 more worksheets to complete. Well, that's an undesirable behavior. But the chances of that increasing and ramping up Sarah's behavior are pretty strong. So punishment is not going to be in the top of my toolbox. We can, for some students, remove that desirable activity. So some examples might be a token economy that's been put into place. And so every time a student exhibits an inappropriate behavior, Sarah cursing and ripping up her math paper, she would have to pay me back. The problem with response cost procedures is that sometimes when students get into a cycle with us of having to pay for things, then they lose all motivation to try and earn things because in their minds, what's the point of trying to work for something when you're just going to take it away? And some students, we catch them being good so rarely that we actually cause an increase in that behavior. So response cost systems have a place in education. We just have to be very careful about the use of them. Timeout procedures, there's several different types of timeout, and I'm going to talk about one that I consider appropriate and ones that I consider to be inappropriate or like at the bottom of our toolbox. So exclusionary and non-exclusionary timeouts are 2 choices, and when we think about non-exclusionary timeout, I would say this is at the top of our bottom barrel. So in non-exclusionary timeout, the student remains in the classroom. And what I use this term a lot that I put at the bottom is timeout from reinforcement. So if a student like Sarah has ripped up her math paper, what I'm going to do is I'm going to ramp up the fun in my classroom and I'm going to tell every single kid, I love the way you're working today. For those of you that are finishing your math worksheet, I've got a special reward for you today and I'm going to start handing out that reward and I'm going to make a huge deal about it. For those of you, if you've got a messy paper, there's an extra paper on my desk. That gives Sarah an out. Go find the paper on my desk. So I'm not giving her attention for a negative behavior. I'm increasing the fun for everybody else. She's remained in the instructional area, and this is key. I might not be paying attention to her that she can see, but definitely she's still in the environment where she can learn. Exclusionary timeout are when kids are out of the classroom, and we really have to be careful about this. Exclusionary timeouts can affect their time of service and their IEPs and require remediation, and it also removes them from instruction. So before you remove a child from the classroom, think about how you are going to make up instruction and if leaving the classroom is really, really, really necessary. A lot of times it's not. If you've got any questions about what we've learned today, please let me know. Continue your work in Chapter 9, and I'm looking forward to talking